And this is KAOS 89.3 FM, Olympia Community Radio. The following commentary is not necessarily the opinions of the staff, management, or underwriters of KAOS or the Evergreen State College. It is the opinions of the guest and the host. That being said, it's time to talk a little bit about some of the things coming up in the community. All the electrons working. Let's see if we have the right microphone. Can you say hello?
Hello, everybody.
All right, try that again.
Hello, Kim.
Let's see. Now we've got it.
Okay, come in.
Yeah. All right, we got to get our mic placement a little bit better, but a little bit closer. About 3 inches there. Not very sensitive mics. All right, well, welcome to the program, Michael. We've been chatting back and forth for a couple of weeks about having you on the air. And you are a professor at the Evergreen State College, and you teach interdisciplinary, can't say it, discipline, you say it.
Interdisciplinary studies.
Okay, I'm tongue-tied. History and political economy. And you're the author of Diversity in Education, Critical Multicultural Approach, and Transforming the Multicultural Education of Teachers, Theory, Research, and Practice. So, yeah, we've been having an ongoing discussion about police violence, excessive violence, and its effect on people of color in this country. And we were staying really local with the stories of the two boys, Crystal Chaplin's boys, Bryson and Andre, who were part of I guess they were attempting to shoplift some beer at a Safeway on the west side, and then they were pursued by Officer Ryan Donald. And the story is he called for backup, but was hot on their tail apparently, and they were escaping on skateboards towards their house. And with carrying nothing, as far as I know, they left the beer in the store. So, long story short, he confronted them, and they apparently raised up their skateboards and spun them around or something, and it didn't strike the officer, but appears that Bryson, according to the attending surgeon at Harborview when he was flown out, that he caught a bullet in his spine as he was running away, because there was no entrance wound, and the bullet is in his back and not at the front of his spine. So, and I don't know how that didn't come out in the hearings, but it was magically eliminated from testimony. So instead of a confrontation, it was an attempt to get away. So this is the problem with these stories, is when they're told by the press, they get twisted around, and it's fashioned in a way to create a sort of propaganda effect that, well, this officer was overwhelmed and had to use his maximum force instead of his pepper spray or his taser.
Yeah, the problem with this is when we just look at what Officer Donald did and the shooting as an isolated incident that just happened in Olympia without a historical perspective. We're really lost on understanding this. We can just say, well, this was an example of someone who overreacted, but it's much more complicated than that. And you know, the police just have this long history of being protected, and it's no accident. You know, in the state of Washington, probably your previous guest may have pointed that out in regards to state of Washington has the most extreme litmus tests for officers. You have to prove that they used force with, quote, without malice, and that they were acting in good faith. So you have to show somehow that Officer Donald was acting in bad faith and with malice, which is almost impossible for prosecutors to prove in a court of law. So we'll see what comes out with this case in this situation. Prosecutors were getting together last year. I really thought they were going to bring something to the legislature, and they did not. So that was a huge disappointment. But prosecutors and the police have had a long history of cozy relationships, not just in Washington State, but across the United States. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the police investigated themselves. That's the norm around the country, unless the U.S. Justice Department steps in, and then you can begin to have some sense of an impartial investigation.
Yeah, and in the case of in Ferguson, Missouri, they had a grand jury, which the grand juries operate under a whole set of different rules, and I'm not a lawyer, so, but I know that they can operate secretly if they want, and it appears the bar for the jury is, I don't think it's held up quite as high as it is for a public trial.
What's interesting, since Ferguson signals a kind of a new national social movement. You had young people out on the streets just continuously, and that drew attention nationally. It morphs into what we know as Black Lives Matter today. And we probably, you and I and your listeners, we wouldn't even be talking about the shooting in Olympia, really, if it hadn't been for Ferguson and Black Lives Matter. Also, what's instructive about Ferguson is that suddenly the nation began to get a lesson in Grand Jury 101, a beginner's course, how do grand juries work. So there was a lot of interest suddenly in this grand jury. Grand juries have been going on for centuries. The whole idea, is there enough evidence to go forward with a trial? And in Ferguson, they said no. It was unusual that the Darren Wilson, the officer who shot Michael Brown, unarmed adolescent, multiple times, was allowed to testify on his own behalf. So there was, it smelled bad from the get-go with the way the prosecutor presented information. We only have the censored documents from that those hearings, and what's happened now, they've turned those over to the family and the lawyers, which will be very interesting, the uncensored version. But they're the only ones that have access to that. We get little sense of it from the Justice Department's 2 reports on Ferguson. But they didn't go ahead with prosecuting Darren Wilson, which again is instructive for us in Olympia, Thurston County, state of Washington. Basically, the Department of Justice concluded, and I'm just reading from the Justice Department report, it says, Darren Wilson's actions do not constitute prosecutable violations. And they're referring to federal statutes that prohibits the use of deadly force that are, quote, objectively unreasonable, as defined by the Supreme Court. Well, it had to be objectively unreasonable. So, again, we're looking at something that says objectively unreasonable that is determined subjectively by the police officer. No one witnessed what happened to Michael Brown for the entire 90 to 120 seconds when he received multiple bullets to his body that ended with a bullet to the top of his head, execution style. Now that has not, but Wilson was not seen as being objectively unreasonable in all of those actions.
Hold on here.
Sure.
Yeah. Now there was a witness. It was a friend of Michael's who was at a distance. And he mysteriously was also killed within a couple of days of Michael's death. So the only witness really was dead.
Well, there's witness, we know witness 101. That's how the person that was with Michael Brown that day. He, in fact, did not, no one, as far as we can tell by the reports, actually saw it totally, because witness 101 actually hides behind a car for part of the while.
Right. He's probably afraid of being shot.
Sure, sure. Other witnesses saw bits and pieces. Darren Wilson didn't see the whole event, so no one has seen the whole event. We can put together a narrative based on that, and on those
right.
events. So there's a number of witnesses that did see bits and pieces, and then their testimonies were seen as not reputable because, number one, they were some had criminal records, so they were eliminated. Others did not come forward and testify because of community fear of the police. So there were multiple reasons we don't have a full picture of what happened on that day.
Now, wouldn't you call that suppression of eyewitnesses by the threat of either prosecution or persecution by the Ferguson police force?
Well, for some people that was they did not want to come forward because of a history in Ferguson of retaliations. As you probably know, Ferguson isn't alone in the United States of running basically what might be called a modern peonage system of putting people into debt for walking in the street, which Brown and his friend were doing, or having tall grass in their yards, or barking dogs, or traffic stops where people are getting into debt. And that's the way Ferguson was making money. They were running it as a capitalist enterprise.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the Justice Department came in and said they issued a cease and desist to stop that system of ticketing people to pay for operations for the police force, because that's what was going on. And then there was collection agencies that garnered income from the interest on the unpaid traffic fines, regardless of the person's ability to pay the fine off in the first place.
Yeah, that was the order. We don't know the extent of really what's going on. We don't have like a day-to-day report of that. There is a new police chief, identifies as African American, just hired in the last month or so. He's got a huge task based on the history of Ferguson.
One more question. Now Ferguson is fairly near East St. Louis, right?
Yeah, it's across the river.
Across the river, yeah. East St. Louis, I know from just knowing what I know about friends that have lived in the area in St. Louis, say that East St. Louis is kind of a terrible place too as well. There's a lot of crime. There's a lot of kind of polluting industries and low-paying jobs, and there's a lot of poverty there too as well. So
yeah, East St. Louis, Missouri, Illinois, actually.
Oh, it's Illinois.
Yeah,
so.
is one of the poorest school districts in the United States. Jonathan Kozel, education writer, wrote a book a few years ago called Savage Inequalities, and uses East St. Louis for his example of underfunded schools. But actually, you go outside St. Louis, within the county, you just have pockets of segregation and poverty. Many people don't realize that the freed slave and then enslaved slave, Dred Scott, famous Dred Scott case a few years before the Civil War, where the Supreme Court Justice declared that basically Dred Scott as a black man had no rights which the white man had to respect. And he's told that no, he is not free, he's still a slave. He can't go from slavery to free back to slave, so he was considered still a slave. And what's interesting, why I bring up Dred Scott, he's buried 6 miles from Ferguson. So this whole notion of the racism that's embedded historically has not gone away, as far as how police officers perceive people of color, and especially African Americans.
Brings to mind Michelle Alexander's work, and things the new Jim Crow.
The history of incarceration, yeah.
And that brings to mind the sentencing bills that were signed by Bill Clinton in 1994 when he was president. The 3 strikes you're out bill, the term super predator, I think that you've written about here. I think I have a article that you wrote, Hillary Clinton and the Origin of the Super Predator. Although the Clintons have backpedaled on all that, and they claim that it was Congress's fault and they just signed the bill.
Yeah, that is hard to swallow. They were part of the zeitgeist there, the right-wing move of the Democratic Party to win the law and order vote and tough on crime, and they did it at the expense of young African Americans and helped set up what we call, what's referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline. So we have cops in schools at unprecedented numbers, and the effect on those schools, researchers have shown, is negative on the whole. So schools have been semi-fortified, so to speak, by police, and we've just created this kind of hostile environment now in high schools, down to elementary schools, cases of 5-year-olds pointing their fingers as if it were a gun and then being handcuffed or suspended. Children being thrown out of their desks by police officers. Caught on videos, thank goodness. That's probably the best thing that students could do with their smartphones, is capture those images. So it's a horrendous police state that has been created since the mid-90s in the United States.
Yeah, in fact, the private prison business has become so huge. It's now expanded into immigration prisons, and the new laws about locking up illegal immigrants and the per diem charges these private prisons, like the Geo Group, charge the federal government for every day they're incarcerated. And one of the problems I like to bring up is our very own INS detention facility down in Tacoma, down at the port of Tacoma. A lot of times they'll pick up Central American brush pickers out of the Northwest here, because that's how they make their money, and INS does raids in Shelton and Mason County because they're within 100 miles of the federal borders.
Many people don't realize this was all created after 9/11. We think of our public school civics class where you learn about the 3 branches of government: the executive, judicial, legislative. Well, we've got a 4th branch, and that's called the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They have their separate courts. They're not accountable to their lawyers of defendants. Again, we've got a shadow government operating, and you can throw in Guantanamo military courts there, and it's really the whole idea of an independent judiciary has been tainted over immigration and how the military has handled things. So it's morphed together in a way of what you might call extra judicial action outside the normal legal means for due process. We all assume that we have due process, that we have our day in court, but not if you're an immigrant. You should. Everyone should in the United States. I mean, undocumented children are, by the Supreme Court, allowed to go to public schools, for example. So when anyone's in the United States, they should be afforded the rights of due process, but that's been violated by Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE.
Yeah, just to tag on to what I was talking about, the GEO group is many times these Central American people that are brought in, they only speak a few words of Spanish, and the rest of is their native language. It's in Mayan dialect, and there's not very many translators, especially lawyers, that can speak Mayan. So their due process is already violated, and so they get held longer because they can't answer questions, they can't give details, so they get held.
Absolutely, excellent point. The Washington State technically does not have any private prisons, so that's a federal.
That's a federal prison, yes.
Right. So that's how. And there's been some conservative groups that want to create private prisons in the state of Washington, but they've been rebuffed so far. So that's our big private prison is run by the feds. And there's no sign on Interstate 5 as you're going to Seattle or whatever that says, "Oh, turn off this exit." It's pretty well hidden.
Yeah, it's right down in kind of industrial zone near the port berths and the loading docks.
Yeah, about the only time you go there if you get lost.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's amazing. I mean, I guess the point is that there's an uneven system of justice according to your skin color, your nationality, your income, your social status. So there's several ways you can get caught in the system, and the other part of the system I think that we need to recognize is, in my opinion, that we need to start recognizing drug abuse as a public health problem. It's not a crime, it's a public health problem. We don't have treatment for everyone. There is no federal program for treatment of the indigent unless you commit a crime.
But what a moneymaker it's been.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And how it's disenfranchised so many people of color. So one point I like to bring out is that this has such a long history, and why the country needs a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to look at this, like South Africa, other countries that have just had horrendous histories. And I tend to go back to the colonial law of Virginia, 1705 slave codes, that said if harm is inflicted in any way on an African American, and if that African American would die during the course of correction, it will be as if it had never happened. That's the language of the slave code, as if it had never happened. We forget that there were not police in the United States during the colonial era, or even most of the 1800s. There were slave patrols too. So we go from militias to slave patrols to militias, and then we have suddenly the so-called modern urban police force, late 1800s, early 20th century. Well, they grew out of that history of inflicting harm on people and having it as if it had never happened. We can say, well, that was then. We just have to look at Chicago's been exposed for having a detention center where they tortured people as if it had never happened.
Yeah, they disappear in that place. It's a building in
Yes.
Chicago where they're diverted squad car to this building before they're even booked into the local precinct. And they disappear for a few hours where they're interrogated without due process.
So we know that that's going on, that happened in Chicago. A reporter for The Guardian comes out and confronts the police. The police union continues to deny that it actually exists. And this Guardian reporter says the police are behaving, quote, as if it had never happened. Reporter down in Ferguson, who was a group of reporters of color who were detained for 24 hours being journalists. When they got out, the journalist says, wow, there's no charges. It's as if it had never happened. So these are phrases that they're saying, and when I heard those, I thought, Virginia Slave Code, 300 and some years ago, is still in operation. So the advantage that we have is we have now people with, they're carrying their cameras on their phones, tape recorders. So the playing field's a little more balanced in terms of transparency than it was 20 years ago.
We do have a few weapons as citizen journalists, and certainly kudos to those citizens that don't shy away from videotaping on their phones what they consider to be violations of constitutional rights, because we're not going to have any rights if we don't remain diligent in our observations and what happens to everyday people, even people we don't know, because a lot of times there will be nobody to vouch for their safety.
Yeah, it's been so impressive that strangers who don't know a victim are willing to see that this is an unjust situation and to record it and sometimes make that public at great risk to themselves, because police harassment is known to happen when people have exposed their behavior.
I think we're coming around to the end of our time together here today, but is there anything you'd like to close with, Michael?
I'll bring it back locally.
Okay.
And that's, I know there's a big push to have a community review board for the police. I think that's just cosmetic, and that might do something, but it's not going to stop the police investigating themselves in this cozy relationship with prosecutors. I've advocated, and others have across the United States, to have a special prosecutor at the state level who immediately gets all the evidence from the police. So we don't have this situation where Officer Donald and other officers across the United States get this cooling off period and they get their story, so to speak, straight. That in fact, we need to know immediately, have all the evidence available. And a community review board isn't going to get that because it won't have that legal status as a state level special prosecutor that's basically right there, who would immediately get data, and that should be shared with the community. So that's what I hope could come out of the legislation, Washington State Legislature in this coming year, but we'll see what happens.
I would say that the Association of Police and Sheriff's Officers are going to have something to say about that. I don't think they want transparency.
No, they don't, and it's a shame that they're called a union, because police have busted unions, and so anybody who supports unions should see that this is a facade of police unions. The whole term is a misuse. Basically, is to protect themselves against public scrutiny and allow them to do whatever they want as if it had never happened.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable thing to understand about the slave code. I didn't know that. It's something I learned today about where that comes from. Joni Mitchell calls it just ice. It's not justice. It's not served out equally, and it's certainly a broken system that we need to change. And I really like your ideas about the Citizens Review Panel and making it stick with a legislative RCW code to go along with it, not just we'll be an advisory board and
We'll all feel good.
yeah, we'll all feel good. We'll be able to print it in the newspaper and say something happened. But still, policies don't change unless the law is behind it. I want to thank you, Michael Vavris, professor here at Evergreen State College, and looking forward to having conversations in the future.
All right, thanks for having me, Kim.
Yeah, you're sure welcome. This is KAOS 89.3 FM, Olympia Community Radio. And this is also Parallel University. I'm your host, Tim Dobson. It's been really great to have Michael in the house here. And this is KAOS 89.3 FM, Olympia Community Radio. Following commentary is not necessarily the opinions of the staff, management, or underwriters of KAOS or the Evergreen State College. It is the opinions of the guest and the host. Bernie Meyer is in the house with us. Welcome to the program, Bernie.
Thanks, Kim. Good to be here with you. It's a great day.
It's a great day. It's sad to see Daniel Berrigan leave the planet, but he did live a long life.
94 years, practically 95. 4 days or 5 days before he died was his birthday.
Yeah, he was one of my heroes as a conscience objector in the 70s, I was objector from 1969 when I got my conscience objector status.
That's a key year. That's the year of the Catonville 9.
Yeah, I was inspired by the Berrigans, in fact.
Catonville 9 in 1968, yeah.
Yeah, well, sure enough, there was a lot of anti-war stuff going on, in fact, in social movements, in music, and if I had my stuff together, I would be playing some Country Joe and the Fish, I Think I'm Fixin' to Die, and...
Can you do that? I'd like to see you do that.
Well, we do that sometimes around the campfire, but...
Yeah.
No, there was a lot of great music then. There was, Peter, Paul, and Mary had a lot of anti-war stuff, and so did Pete Seeger and
Joan Baez.
Yeah, Bob Dylan, and
Yep.
they were all working for peace, and like so many others, like the Berrigans, they were just working in different areas, and the mass media, that was one way to get out with your music.
Exactly. It was a big way. It was a really significant way.
I think that the combined actions of all the musicians and the anti-war activists actually ended the war, and the fact that the news media back then was not embedded, and ABC, NBC, CBS all had their cameramen on the ground in Saigon, so they were photographing a lot of what was going on and a lot of the cruelty that was happening against the Vietnamese people, coming out in Life magazine and Time, and there was great photo stories too as well.
To see the young girl, about 12, 13 years old, naked, walking with her arms out. She had just been napalmed.
Right, she had incredible third-degree burns.
Right. They'd see that in the news, from Vietnam, just shook people, shook me, as well as other photos that came out of that period.
Yeah, I think Richard Nixon was very worried about the anti-war movement, and I know that they provided a lot of propaganda for the Defense Department would come in after these things and say what a wonderful job we were doing routing those communists.
Sure, definitely, they wanted to create the image of the evilness of the people over in Vietnam. Yeah, I went to the 40th anniversary remembrance of the Kent State event.
Kent State
May
Massacre.
4th, 1970, I went to the 40th anniversary. And they had alternatives to that remembrance and documentaries. And one of the claims was Nixon was considering using nuclear weapons in Vietnam. But when the protests started in Cambodia, he was told we cannot use nuclear weapons. It wouldn't go with the American people. So whether that's true or not, I haven't seen the actual proof of that, but I think there's probably a lot of truth to it. At least that they were considering it.
Well, yeah, and there was a lot of talk most recently with Obama's visit to Tokyo and going to Hiroshima as well.
Yes.
And being part of I believe he was there on the day that Hiroshima was bombed. And he showed up and said he was going to make no apologies for American misbehavior in Hiroshima, the bomb that was dropped there.
Yeah, he did not make any apologies. Right. That would have produced a reaction that I don't think we're ready to deal with, at least on a governmental, political level. We're not ready to deal with that because it means that the Air Force who dropped the bomb would need to come out with some kind of a reaction, and it'd probably be a very negative reaction if the president said that, as well as the whole military-industrial complex, which is based on making nuclear weapons and having a first strike capability of using the nuclear weapons. So this is what we're involved in. So for the president to make an apology would to be open up that whole box, and it's a huge Pandora's box. But that's one I'm working on, one of the issues I'm working on.
Yeah, that's been one of my issues too, as a frequent flyer in the 80s to Ground Zero protests.
Yeah.
Yeah, never got arrested, but was there at the gates leafleting them every Thursday
I
morning.
just got arrested on Mother's Day.
Yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Did you cross over the federal line?
The federal line, which is about
That's
the fourth or fifth time I've crossed the federal line. That's the blue line that enters federal property. They're owned by the United States government and the U.S. Navy. And so...
Similar to Indian Island, there was a protest about 10 or 12 years ago in Chimacum, where we marched from Chimacum to Indian Island, and
I was there.
you were there. Did
Yeah.
you get arrested there too?
No, I did not. But I was there.
The 38 people were arrested, and 2 crossed over the federal line, and they went to federal prison rather than just getting booked into Jefferson County Jail.
Yeah, that's what happens if you go to federal. You're not necessarily go to prison. Last time he dropped charges for me, but we don't know what's going to happen this time. 3 of us walked over that line to say we must abolish nuclear weapons, and I connected it with climate change, because if we don't deal with one, we can't deal with the other. If we don't develop trust in dealing with climate change, how are we going to have trust in abolishing nuclear weapons between the governments that are involved here? It's huge.
Yeah, it is huge, and going back just briefly to what Mr. Obama's comments to the current president of Japan, he also couldn't apologize for nuclear weapons because he just signed a $1 trillion so-called Nuclear Modernization Act that the Defense Department and the Energy Department submitted to him. So it would be extremely hypocritical for him to apologize and, on the one hand, devote $1 trillion of federal tax dollars to that purpose.
For me, yeah, it's a nice gesture to go to Hiroshima, and I'm glad he did it. But it's the actions that you have to pay attention to. as much, if not more, and for me more, than the words.
Right. It's the actions, it really is. Watch what I do, not what I say.
And that's where Dan Berrigan comes in, and people like him. Yeah.
Yeah, now Dan, we spoke briefly about Catonsville, Maryland, where the federal draft board had an office, and it was fairly unprotected. And so, was it Phil and Dan Berrigan both, or was it?
It was 9 people. The Catonsville 9 went in there, and most of them were Roman Catholic priests, nuns who had worked in various parts of the world, especially with the poorest and most oppressed or difficult situation type people. So Dan and Phil were a big part of it. Dan and Phil were brothers, and Phil had already been sent to prison for the Baltimore 4 action, 3/4 of a year before that. So he had a three-year sentence for that. So this was a huge action, and at that time, 1968, May 1968. This was a huge action, not just for people in general in the country, but for people who are working on the Vietnam War issue, destroying property, burning draft records with napalm. My God, this is destruction of property. Even Dorothy Day, who was very radical in the gospel sense of the word with the Catholic worker movement, could not at first get over the destruction of property. So it was an alarming wake-up type of action that they performed on May 1968. And
weren't the local police alerted? They were.
no, not that way. What happened? This is where the hit and stay idea comes. They would alert media people.
Okay, so they would get the
And
media.
media people were invited, and this is what I did with next year after that, 1969, with the DC-9 action. You invite the media. I led the media to the Washington Post office across the street from the Dow Chemical office in Washington, D.C. In Catonsville, they alerted the media and had them coming to it, and the media didn't know what they were going to. They just took the word of the people that invited them, and this is what the hit and stay production will show how that came about. And of course, the action was not against people, and so the people at the draft board office would invite the police after the action. Meanwhile, the people who took the draft board files out to the parking lot, used homemade napalm from the U.S. manual on how napalm is made, and set the files on fire, and then formed a circle around the fire, and waited to be arrested if that was what the police choose to do, which absolutely they did do. So that's the idea of hit and stay. It's taking responsibility for your actions, and facing the consequences, to speak the truth, to say why you did this and what it means. And so that's the idea behind the Catonsville 9 action, which started a whole series of actions over the next 6-7 years. And that's what the Hit and Stay movie documentary goes into, how it developed from a small group of people, 9 people, mostly Catholic, clergy, nun types, and it developed into a more secular hit and run process. And so the value of that is the showing how that triggered things, how that resonated with what young people were experiencing, the people that were being drafted or going to be drafted, or the people that was seeing how our forces were being used in Vietnam to kill villagers, like the My Lai massacre, which is not one type of event, but many events, or the use of napalm. People of conscience came forward, and that's generated the anti-war idea, anti-Vietnam War, and moved the country in going through these various court experiences over these years, where that finally at Camden, 28 people were found innocent. But there's a tremendous dynamic in this process, and it relates, from my point of view, to what is happening now with the young people coming forward, very concerned about what's going on to their lives, and supporting people like Bernie Sanders. It reminds me very much of what's happening now at that time. So to me, the relevance of remembering Dan Berrigan and learning what he was about and how he went about it, and then viewing the the Hit and Stay documentary and all the other actions that followed from that, there's a lot to learn and apply to now.
Yeah, it's been encouraging for sure to see the groundswell of interest in the Bernie Sanders campaign with more peace and justice issues and environmental responsibility. And 40 years worth of Bernie Sanders saying the same thing since he was mayor of Burlington, or town councilman. He hasn't changed his message since he started, all the way up to being a U.S. Senator. So he has a track record of not flip-flopping on the issues. He's consistent, and he's always spoken out against war.
Well, I don't know how much about the foreign policy part of his message. I have some concerns about it.
Well, there is some dark spots too.
But the people concerns that young people are, well, older people like me, relating to too. I resonate very much with that, and I think we're in a situation of great change. I want to talk a little bit of, about why I got involved with Dan Berrigan, and compare that with what just happened this week with the pre-announcement of Hillary Clinton being the Democratic choice for the presidential candidate the night before the California and other primaries. I want to compare that with what happened in 1968. I was a young priest in Cleveland at that time, and I was involved with the clergy intern program to teach clergy of various faiths how to relate to the social issues. The Vietnam War, of course, but the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King was assassinated in '68, just a couple of months before Robert Kennedy was assassinated. The poverty movement, the anti-poverty movement, all these things were stirring us up, and I was a young priest, and getting involved myself, but we weren't trained to deal with these things. So that's why I got in the clergy intern program, a one-year program. Well, Robert Kennedy was assassinated at the California primary in 1968, June 5th, 1968. Okay? He was assassinated. And the young people who were supporting him, and my wife-to-be was supporting him by organizing college students. Well, all these young people who were supporting Robert Kennedy didn't know what to do when Kennedy was assassinated. Who were they going to support? What does it mean? And a lot of them either gave up or went to the left, went outside the conventional political system to get more involved with dealing with those issues that we were talking about. That was a tremendous thing. I myself finished that program in June, just at the same time Kennedy was killed. I was freed up to travel. The bishop had nothing for me to do, so I looked up Dan Berrigan in Ithaca, New York, where he was teaching at Cornell, and he took me with him to New England for visiting and speaking tour. And 3 other times that summer, I met Dan at his invitation in several different places, including a retreat in September. That retreat in September had people of all stripes of anti-war people, and it led to the next action after Catonville, the Milwaukee 14 in November. I could have been part of that, but I decided to go back to Cleveland, where I'm from, to get my base together and take part in the action after that, which I did do, which was a Dow Chemical action in what do you call it, March of 1969. So I got arrested. I went to prison for that. So Dan was a part of my development during that period.
So Dow Chemical, just to be clear, they were manufacturing Agent Orange, right, for defoliating the jungle in Vietnam?
Definitely, and I was more conscious of the napalm. You know, remember
They were making napalm too?
They were making napalm, but they were also making Agent Orange. I was aware of it, but not aware of the extent. And during the process after my action, Vietnam people went to Vietnam, educated me about napalm, and now I'm pretty knowledgeable about it and seeing the effects of napalm on the generations, the new generations, the 3rd and 4th generation today. It's still there in the atmosphere, and it's still there in the bodies of people that were in South Vietnam at that time, where it was used, as well as U.S. soldiers and veterans, as well as veterans from several other countries, Korea and Australia, and all those people were affected by Agent Orange. Dioxin, most
that was the chemical.
chemical.
Right, and it took many years for the VA administration to admit that many of the cancers that the returning soldiers were getting were from exposure to Agent Orange, because they had their hands in it. They were soaked in it in many cases if they were in an area that had just been defoliated. Not to mention the Vietnamese that were suffering from all kinds of illnesses from it too, and cancers later on.
That's right. Our soldiers did not know those effects. They were using the barrels that the Agent Orange came in to put water in to take showers with, as well as using it to defoliate around the bases that they were at. The Da Nang Air Force Base is very lethal.
Contaminated, yeah. Well, we've got about 3 minutes, Bernie, and in conclusion, what can you tell us about Dan Berrigan, and how would you sum up Dan's life?
Well, Dan was a poet. He was a Jesuit priest, and he was pulled in by his younger brother Phil into activism, and he made activism his life. So he was arrested many times, imprisoned many times, and if I could read his poem "Some," would that be a
Sure,
poem?
we got time.
It kind of expresses Dan's way of calling and challenging people. Some stood up once and sat down. Some walked a mile and walked away. Some stood up twice, then sat down. I've had it, they said. Some walked 2 miles, then walked away. It's too much, they cried. Some stood and stood and stood, and they were taken for fools. They were taken for being taken in. Some walked and walked and walked. They walked the earth, they walked the waters, they walked the air. Why do you walk, they were asked, And why do you stand? Because of the children, they said, and because of the heart, and because of the bread. Because the cause is the heart's beat, and the children born in the risen bread.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Bernie. And thanks for coming in today. We always appreciate your views, and looking forward to the next time we have you on the air.
Thank you, Kim, and I hope people come next Thursday.
Yeah, that's Thursday on the 16th at
That's right.
6:30 p.m. at Traditions,
Right,
downtown Olympia, 5th and Water.
exactly.
So be there. This is KAOS 89.3 FM, Olympia,